right, episode 16 of the Coded for Chaos podcast. Today we have Glenn Gerstell, former General Counsel of the National Security Agency and Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I got that right this time.
Good.
I'm a DC acronym expert, but sometimes they just start flying around all in your head and you can't unjumble them. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Sort of the I think we mentioned it before, but we don't know each other very well. Our shtick is where people come by my basement in DC. It's close enough to downtown that sometimes somebody can pop up from K Street or whatever and just have a chat. I spent a lot of time in the intelligence community. You spent some time in the intelligence community. Interesting path into it, from what I could tell. I'd like to learn more about that because what we like to learn is kind of like how people backgrounds and how they got into it. So you're a lawyer.
That's right.
And somehow you ended up at the National Security Agency. You must have been doing something pretty relevant to end up there as a lawyer. Tell us about that.
It was just a serious clerical error.
Okay.
No.
They were a strange HR system.
Exactly. They were selecting another guy and wound up with me. No, it was you're right. It was an unexpected twist in my career. I spent my entire time as a lawyer in private practice, always interested in public service. And over the years, I had done some volunteer work, including here in the District of Columbia. And I was also appointed by President Obama to the National Infrastructure Advisory Council. So I'd always been on the sort of edges of Homeland Security, not national security, not the intelligence community, but the Homeland Security through volunteer positions. And when I got close to retirement age at my law firm, which had a mandatory retirement age, a few years before then, I started thinking, what am I going to do afterwards? And I started knocking on doors in Washington and mostly in the federal government saying, was there anything I could do? I could be a wonderful deputy assistant to Secretary of Paperclips somewhere. And I couldn't find anything that was where A, they wanted me, or B, I was interested in. But a friend who was then the General Counsel of the Department of Defense called up one day and said, I know you've been looking for an interesting public service opportunity. This position is about to become available via NSA, and you should apply for it. And my first reaction was he's got the wrong phone number. But the more I looked into it, the more fascinating it was. I didn't know anything about it in great detail. But I had previously been, during my legal career, very involved in telecommunications, undersea cables, internet data centers, cellular telephone operations, more on the sort of project finance side than on the regulatory side. So I sort of knew a little bit about the industry and the telecommunications business and technology. I'm not an engineer, an expert, but from a lawyer's point of view, I was familiar with this. And so I was fortunate enough to get the position in part because of that experience. They were also looking for an outside lawyer who had management experience. I'd been a managing part of a law firm. So it sort of made sense, at least on paper. The minute I got there, I discovered that maybe it didn't make sense because, wow, was I in over my head. As a lawyer, you're sort of trained to be a quick study and a quick read and learn things pretty quickly. So you tried to draw on that skill a little bit, but I have to admit the first few months was a lot of going uphill in areas that were very unfamiliar. You mentioned acronyms, of course, and just the entire world of being in a top secret facility. I'd never had a desk before that had two computers, one secret and one not secret. And so that just took some time getting used to. But I found that the people there were just fabulous, so dedicated to the mission, so interested in making sure that the country was safe as a result of what NSA was able to do. Politics was not discussed at all in the office. I had no idea whether I worked with Republicans or Democrats. It never came up. Yeah. But boy, the people were just fabulous and helped me learn the ropes. So that was important for me. But it was just an absolutely fascinating experience. I thought I had a great job before as a lawyer in a big Wall Street law firm, but this was a wonderful opportunity for public service.
And NSA acronyms are particularly difficult.
They are.
Yeah, it was just they're changing constantly.
Right.
Lots of X's and all these other things going on.
Right.
And then you got the military acronyms combined with the NSA sort of traditional acronyms.
Right. And then I could understand the acronyms for top secret programs. That made sense that you didn't want to refer to them by a specific name.
Right.
But a lot of the things that puzzled me were code names for just routine kinds of things, and I'll make it up to be silly, but they had a code name for paper. And I said, well, that's just a piece of paper. No, that's a so-and-so. And so A lot of things had unnecessary code names.
Yeah. So you spent 4 years there?
Almost 5.
Almost 5 years.
Just shy of 5. Started under President Obama's term, and then in President Trump's first term, which was about 3 years into President Trump's first term. It was a civil service position, so technically it didn't change with administrations, and it wasn't political in that sense. It's one of 2 general counsel positions in the federal government at that level that aren't Senate confirmed. The other one's the FBI and NSA, and both have been deliberately kept non-Senate confirmed because they don't want them subject to politics or partisan issues, which I think is the right approach. There were attempts while I was there to make it a Senate confirmed position because that's the rank it has, but those were resisted.
Oh yeah, there's too much room for the slippery slope there.
Yeah, by contrast, the CIA, after a series of problems, the Congress made the CIA General Counsel a Senate confirmed position. You could argue back and forth whether that's right or wrong. I understand the sensitivities there. And of course, the General Counsels at the big cabinet departments, Homeland Security, Department of Agriculture and Defense, et cetera, they're all Senate confirmed. But that's a difference. Those are policy-making organizations. It was, as I said, the building up at Fort Meade, where NSA is located, was just fundamentally non-political.
Yeah, absolutely. How much did your role overlap to Cyber Command? Was there a separate general counsel there?
There isn't a technically general counsel. There's a staff judge advocate general, but there was a staff judge,
the senior JAG officer, basically. Yes.
Right, exactly, and who reported to the senior military lawyers in the Pentagon. But yes, the command has its own, in effect, general counsel, whom I worked with literally every day. We were just in the same building, just 2 floors apart, and we were often in and out each other's offices. It helped that we had a good relationship. The person who was there during most of that time was Gary Korn, who's now a professor at American University here in Washington, and a fabulous guy. And he and I were in our offices all the time. My legal work did not extend to the command's work, and his similarly did not extend to NSA. And we had the NSA General Counsel's office had, about 100 lawyers, and his was a much smaller shop. But many of the issues were the same. Every now and then a Fourth Amendment question would come up, or some federal government contracting question would come up, which were common to both. And so there's a considerable overlap between the two at the legal end, and of course at the operational end, there's extensive coordination, which is exactly why they're co-housed together.
Yeah, we had Admiral Mark Montgomery on the podcast, and we talked extensively on camera, off camera about his thoughts as whether there was going to be a separate branch of the military, a cyber force stood up. I've heard a lot of talk about that just in the last 2 weeks. That we might all be surprised by the announcement of this. Who knows? That's a big thing to do. It happened to a Space Force to some extent, I guess.
Yes, and most of the discussion has been about. There are 2 discussions going on. One is separating Cyber Command from NSA, with splitting the so-called dual hat and having a separate boss for each organization. There are a lot of good reasons to keep them separate. There are also some good reasons to take them apart. You could argue both sides. I happen to think that ultimately they should be split. I'm not quite sure it's ready yet, but just because there's so much operational connection between the two. Yeah. But I think long-term they probably should be split because these are 2 24-hour day jobs, and that becomes one 48-hour day job.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, but the question of a separate cyber force is more about getting the personnel to be available to either Cyber Command itself or other cyber units within the military. And it's a sort of a force generation question, not an operational question in particular. And the problem is that we do say this to very simplistic terms, the branches of the military now are somewhat divided. They're a little equivocal or ambivalent about sending people to Cyber Command, because Cyber Command doesn't have its own force generator that it recruits. It recruits from the Army, the Navy, the military, the Marines, etc. And so if you're a hotshot, staff sergeant in the military or in the Army who's interested in cyber, on one hand, the Army sort of wants to keep you in Army cyber. But on the other hand, Cybercom says, well, it'll really be helpful here. So there's always this tension going on. And it's been, I wouldn't say it's a struggle, but there's been some elements of a challenge over the years in staffing cyber command. Oh, that's doing what it's supposed to be. So this is supposed to be a solution. I'm not so convinced about it. I know Mark is a very strong proponent of it. He's got some good reasons about it, and many others. There's a commission that has been set up, including through CSIS, where I am an advisor. And we'll see how this plays out. As I said, there's some good argument pro and con.
I was in the ground floor. I was kind of in the Army's first like deployable cyber unit right after 9/11, when nobody knew anything about cyber, and they just said, "Hey, Captain Thomas, like, help figure out how to stand this thing up." And one of the big parts was trying to manipulate the Army's HR system to get us actual cyber capable people, not just from the military intelligence branch where I was. We were like, we don't care if they're a cook or whatever. Like, if they can do this thing, like, we'll take them.
Sure.
And then, obviously I was just an 03 captain in the Army, and I had a major boss, and, we didn't have the horsepower to make this happen. But we were like, we'd often be called into meetings, and they'd say, "Hey, we're going to go after this target. We can either drop a 500-pound bomb on it, or, hey, cyber dork, what can you do about it?" Or he'd be like, "We might be able to do something, but we might not be able to do something." Like, "Yeah, we're definitely going to drop a 500-pound bomb because you don't seem confident." But this was early days, right? And I've sort of watched that unit. I have watched that unit evolve into like the Army Cyber Brigade and all these other things now. But before that, I was in an MI unit where we had the same problems with linguists, where, like, at least in the Army, some branches of the military handled it better, did a terrible job of maintaining our linguistic core, because you might take a kid who had, was a Korean upbringing, and then they'd send him to learn Persian Farsi, and be like, "Why would you not send?" he's the native speaker. Like, they maybe did a better job at this.
Now that's an area that has been completely overtaken by artificial intelligence, right? And
great point. Yeah,
computers' ability to translate more accurately and idiomatically in any language you want. And as I said, that's a great example of where the services generally struggle to find, especially in these rarer languages, less commonly spoken languages. And now you can get a whole bunch of machine emails or whatever you want, push a button to translate from Urdu into English or whatever.
That's amazing stuff. So what, one of the things we were kind of bouncing around before this, what are your thoughts on the nature of offensive cyber and its use as a deterrence, and on, our force structure, and how we're using it, sort of, so maybe even sort of compared to how we've kept a nuclear war from happening ever since the advent of the nuclear weapon. Are there equivalencies there? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, it's a great question, a topic of perennial and intense debate, not only in Washington, but including in European capitals elsewhere, where NATO's obviously very focused on cyber offense and defense. So look, no one has exploded a nuclear device in hostility for 3/4 of a century now. And that's obviously because there is this sense of deterrence, and everyone knows that every country that possesses it realizes that they're running the risk of suicide if they do it, because of the retaliation. The consequences are too horrific to imagine. So that's an example of a weapon that is just so horrific that nobody uses it because of the consequences, not only world opinion, but actual, God forbid, loss of life, and they're potentially exterminating large chunks of humanity. So the deterrence analogy in cyber goes only so far. There's an element of it, but I think the nuclear deterrence concept is unique in itself for those reasons. The mere fact that the U.S. has a cyber capability, and a good one, isn't deterring very much. And yet, and others have commented on this, the advantage or horror, depending upon which side of the coin you're looking at, of cyber, is that it's possible for a sovereign nation state to intentionally do harm, real harm, economic harm, including, or even physical harm, to another nation state without it triggering, or without being considered an act of war, and without triggering under international law the concept that the other country, the victim country, is allowed to retaliate in self-defense. So this is the so-called gray zone operation, And cyber is wonderful at that. And I'll just give you a great one, example, which a lot of people remember, was in 2014, Sony Pictures was developing a film that depicted the North Korean dictator in rather
Great movie.
in rather unfavorable terms. Shocking, imagine that. And North Korea obviously wasn't happy about it, and the North Korean military decided they were going to launch a cyber attack at Sony Pictures, wiping out, in effect, their computers, just literally turning them into bricks, so to speak, and to the tune of many tens of millions of dollars of that damage at the time, and shutting down operations for Sony Pictures for a while. And the United States' response to that, this was, again, an attack by a sovereign country against a United States.
I was hoping to bring this out.
Was, we said it was terrible, and we were annoyed after we discovered who it was, and there were some mild ramifications and sanctions and things like that, but nothing really serious, nothing that would deter them from doing it again. And imagine if instead the North Korean military had said, like your example before of, forget the cyber, let's just drop a 500-pound bomb. Imagine if North Korea had launched, they didn't have it then, an intercontinental ballistic missile and landed in Culver City, right on top of the Sony Pictures building, and destroyed the building. Yeah. And let's assume that no one was hurt because it was a nighttime. Hopefully, our response would be to have a B-52 bomber moving pretty quickly, right? I mean, we wouldn't tolerate that kind of thing, a missile attack on Homeland Security. So that's a great example of why cyber is possible to have these very pronounced economic effects. And of course, there's this question of, which we could get into if you want to, of exactly what kind of a cyber action, malicious act, would trigger, would be considered an act of war and would trigger an appropriate response. Put that aside for a second. There's some questions about that. But that's the, again, advantage or disadvantage, depending on which side of the coin you're looking at, of cyber, and is a big problem. People in Washington have been extremely upset at not only in the policy-making circles, at not only the ransomware level of ransomware attacks, which, by the way, last year, I just saw a statistic, last year cost $57 billion in economic damage, and that was direct damage, not indirect because if someone couldn't buy something later, but that's companies being closed down or computers being broken there. Just a staggering amount. So as if Washington policy circles are worried about ransomware, understandably, good reason. They're also worried about nation-state attacks, and in particular China, which we could spend some more time on. And there's this desire, there was a Homeland Security subcommittee hearing about 2 weeks ago in which witness after witness said, we need more cyber offense. And every politician on the other side, on the congressional side of the table, Republican and Democrat, said, you're right, we need more cyber threats. We've got to teach China, what they're doing and give them a taste of their own medicine, et cetera, and pounding the table. And of course, no one stood up and said, excuse me, I think we should have a little less cyber. That's politically impossible. Nor am I advocating it for it. But fascinatingly, no one said exactly what we would do with cyber. So fine, great, we'll have more cyber. What exactly is it you want to do? Do you want to tell U.S. Cyber Command to turn the lights off in Beijing, to close down hospitals in Beijing? No, we're not going to do that. That's what Russia does in Ukraine. That's not what the United States does. Are we going to shut down the entire electric grid of China? No, of course not. Are we going to disable all of their nuclear command and control or whatever capability we have to interfere with their weapons? Maybe, but you get to do that only once, and you probably should reserve that to wartime. We're not going to do that today. So my question is, what exactly is it in terms of cyber offense that is going to produce a strategic outcome different? Or put in other words, and with simpler terms, what are we going to do with cyber, just cyber, that's going to cause President Xi to pick up the phone, call the Ministry of State Security in Shanghai and say, hey guys, the temperature's getting a little too hot, knock it off for a while, don't. That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen because of cyber. It might happen if we announced 50% tariffs on Chinese goods and their 17% of their exports can't go to the United States. I don't know what they're going to do with them. They're going to sell them elsewhere. So some economic version of that pressure, which would hurt us too. I'm not advocating, but I'm just saying, my point simply is that cyber alone is not going to produce a strategic outcome, just the way cyber alone isn't going to win a war. in military terms. We see that in Ukraine already. It's part of a campaign. We saw that in Venezuela with Maduro. Cyber was a key part of the military operation, but cyber alone didn't eliminate Maduro nor Venezuela. So we need to understand, as people pound the table demanding more cyber offense, what exactly it is we want with it. Having said that, we certainly should have a robust cyber offensive capability. We want to have that capability in the event of a war. If we have to go to war with Taiwan, to open over Taiwan, I hope that's not in case, we certainly want the ability to hurt China's command and control capabilities over their military, do everything from their satellites to submarine cables, et cetera. And so we want to have the capability to interfere electronically with their operations and make it difficult. We probably also want to do things like pre-positioning ourselves and scout around their network so we know what we're doing. So when, as and if we needed to, so to speak, push the button, we could do that. So I'm not suggesting we don't have a robust and ongoing capability, but actually deploying it in a way that's going to produce a different outcome seems a little more challenging.
Yeah, that's the scout around and kind of be able to pull the trigger when you need to because you have the access. I guess that's one of the real reasons why Cyber Command is still so tied to NSA is because intelligence preparation of the environment in the cyber world is so much more difficult than the kinetic world because you have to it might take you years to get in.
Absolutely. And so when NSA would be told to go find a particular target, some type of foreign target, NSA might get lucky to be able to track the person or the organization or the entity down pretty quickly. Maybe you could break into their computer system or telephone or whatever. Maybe not. That's their business. That's what they're supposed to do. But sometimes if it was particularly well defended or it's a target who uses a burner phone every 2 days and throws away the old phone, it could be really hard to do that and could well take months to gain access. And then once you have access, you want to make sure you're not discovered so that you're shut out of the system. So you want to be sort of quiet and lurking in the system. China's very good at this. We saw that with Volt Typhoon and Storm Typhoon attacks. We can talk about that too. But the United States has robust capabilities in this area too. And it's as you're right, it's not, there's this image that sort of a Hollywood image that the president just walks into, the national security situation room and says, go do this, and someone sits at a keyboard and hacks away right in, and 3 seconds later, a bunch of zeros and ones show up on a keyboard and something happens. That's Hollywood.
Yeah. So changing, pivoting a bit to another big sort of China, more of a cyber-enabled use of, it's not necessarily like offensive cyber, but it's definitely information warfare. TikTok, hot topic right now. What are your thoughts on, do general bans work, in relation to what we're trying to prevent from the type of information that's being disseminated via TikTok? I think a lot of people think TikTok is, if you just barely think about it, you're like, oh, TikTok's stealing our information. Okay, sure. But it's also like feeding us information.
Sure.
So what are your thoughts on how we handle that situation?
Yeah, well, I've talked and written a lot about TikTok, and I'm particularly fascinated with it because it's a microcosm, just a great example of our approach to Chinese technology. It sort of encapsulates everything about it, our erratic, unprincipled approach, our on-again, off-again approach, our legal problems associated with dealing with this and how it's played out, how Congress has struggled to deal with this, how the executive and Congress have gone back and forth. It's just got it's a story that's got everything in it. But TikTok is fascinating for those reasons, and in part because of how quickly it grew. It started in 2016, and it became the fastest growing app on the web of any nature whatsoever, with over 5 billion downloads.
Oh, that's crazy.
And by the way, there are only 8 billion people on the planet. Yeah, so we're talking about 5 billion downloads. It's used by almost 2 billion people. In the United States, about 1 out of every 2 people use it. It's about 170 million average monthly users. In particular, teenagers are addicted to the thing. About 3/4 of all teenagers say they regularly use TikTok. And 1 out of 5 teenagers say they spend 2 to 3 hours a day on it. This is according to the Pew Research Center. So it made an incredible impression in terms of social media application, and it is just pervasive, contains a massive amount of information that people pay attention to. It's really woven itself into American business life, as well as personal life. And just to give you one quick sense of it, I just saw an interesting statistic. Last year, Americans uploaded 900 million videos, no, almost a billion, 900 million videos, just Americans last year at TikTok. And we don't know how long they all were because they average from a few seconds to maybe a few minutes. But just even if they were just a minute long, just on average, they're probably shorter, but even if it's a minute long, and if you do the math, take the 900 million times a minute, there's 525,000 minutes in a year. And so if you decided you wanted to watch all of them and you weren't going to sleep and you weren't going to eat, you were just going to do 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, you'd have to get up in the year 314 AD in order to watch those 900 million videos. So my point in telling you this is to say just how unbelievably pervasive and overwhelming this app is. So now more to the legal point. So Congress decided in 24 in the middle of an election campaign, and by the way, Trump was originally opposed to the ban, to ban this because of the fears of disinformation propagated by its Chinese ownership, and fears that your data would get sucked up and sent back to Beijing for nefarious purposes. Both legitimate concerns, absolutely legitimate concerns. No real proof that that's happened on any kind of material strategic scale yet. There have been instances of it, et cetera, but no, I mean, to be fair, no real proof that that's happened, but the potential's there, and it's a genuine concern, and properly so, I think. On Inauguration Day, the period of time in which ByteDance could have divested came and went. They didn't divest. They still owned it. President Trump, who by then credited TikTok in part with helping him win because young men on TikTok had a big favorable following for Trump. He said, let's just keep extending it. There was no legal basis for him to do that, but he just said, I'm not going to enforce the ban. So we'll just forget the ban for a while until they have this deal that was just announced about a month or so ago. The terms of the deal aren't all that clear. The statute says, and the statute is clear, however, the statute says that if you want to avoid the ban and have that rescinded, you've got to do two things. One, you can't have the Chinese entity own more than 20%. So that part they've done. ByteDance has apparently sold down its share to under 20. So they've checked that box. The other box, not clear they've checked. That box says that TikTok's U.S. operations cannot have, quote, any operational relationship. That's the words of the statute. Any operational relationship, including with respect to the content algorithm, that cannot exist between the former Chinese owner and TikTok USA. Not at all clear they've met that standard. They say they've licensed the algorithm, but what are the terms of license? Can ByteDance pull it back if they don't like it? ByteDance clearly has to be engaged in ongoing operations because TikTok USA needs to operate with the rest of the billion-odd users around the world. Yeah, TikTok in Brazil and elsewhere. So how that works, exactly what ByteDance has, they're clearly involved in some level of updating the algorithm, which is constantly being tweaked. So exactly, I think it's going to be awfully hard for them to prove that there's, quote, no operational relationship. Yeah. So it looks like the statute isn't being complied with, probably. Not sure. And if that's the case, what are we going to do about it as a policy matter? We're going to say, well, it's good enough. Your data is being stored in Oracle's computers in Texas, so we don't have to worry about the data, and we'll watch the disinformation, and there are a bunch of American owners, and it doesn't quite meet the terms of the statute, but it's good enough. Nope, no one's going to complain about it. Certainly the Republicans in Congress aren't going to cross President Trump. And the commercial competitors, such as Meta, Google, others who might complain about another social media platform, they're going to be quiet because they don't want to antagonize the administration, understandably. So I'm not sure that this may be an emperor has no clothes kind of incident. We'll see how this plays out. Congressman Muhlenhart, who heads the China Select Committee in the House, he's issued a press release saying, I'm not so sure this meets the terms of the statute. We'll see where that goes. But again, it's illustrative of our approach to Chinese technology. I might just add as a final matter that although I personally think that banning a social media app is a bad idea. The Supreme Court said that on the First Amendment question, they were going to defer to the executive and allow national security reasons to override this. It was a unanimous decision. I was a little surprised at the decision. I don't necessarily think it's wrong, but it certainly it's problematic. But I think the idea that we want Congress and the executive to make decisions on national security grounds about banning a really pervasive social media app is very problematic. What if the next president, or 8 years from now, 10 years from now, whatever, decides that, CNN is picking something, is a national security threat. We're going to ban CNN or the New York Times, or pick whatever you want.
Yeah.
On alleged national security grounds. I hope we never get there. I hope we don't have those kind of conversations in public, but it's not inconceivable that we could. So I think that's a bad road to go down. I would have preferred some version of the Project Texas thing that the Biden administration came up with, which was a way to put all sorts of audits and responsibility and U.S. control on TikTok. The current arrangement has something comparable, but we'll see how this plays out. But in any event, we've got lots of other Chinese technology that we're not addressing. I mean, all the Internet of Things that on your phone where you can control your garage door and halfway around the world. The app may be a U.S. company, but the back engine to it is probably made by Tuya, a Chinese company that probably controls 70% market share of the kind of apps on your phone that work with the internet, that have your phone talk to a device, whether it's your washing machine or your garage door. That's all Chinese. It's all updated by a server from in China. Not all, it's an exaggeration, but a lot is. And, the American consumer doesn't realize what's going on. And is that a security risk? Well, on some level it is. I mean, that's just, you can imagine if we ever got into a war over Taiwan and China wanted to push the buttons.
Will our systems work when we need them most?
And could China disrupt lots of apps? Could they turn all the traffic lights in a city red? Could they create havoc generally? Those are all legitimate questions.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we have to assume that they would do whatever it takes to disrupt our society, to prevent us from mobilizing forces to go do things. You kind of have to assume that's going to happen.
So it could be a whole bunch of things. It could be purely on the military end, which is making it more difficult for the military to mobilize and communicate and coordinate. That's one certainly understandable thing that you would expect an adversary to do. But it could also be something that affects public opinion. It could just be it could cause, I don't know, they could try to, through cyber means, try to cause Visa or MasterCard to not work for a day, or
just because the email didn't work at the Pentagon,
right? Or a cloud provider, any one of the big cloud providers, Microsoft, Amazon, Google. If a cloud provider, we saw that with some of these unintentional accidents, we saw the havoc that resulted. Imagine if it was a 3-day long outage that affected the entire country, there'd be havoc. Would public opinion say, gosh, well, if that's the case, if that's the price, then forget it. We don't want that. Let them have Taiwan. Would that be the public reaction? Or would it be the reverse? Would it be the public would be so annoyed and upset, they're going to say, darn it, we're not going to let them get away with this, and whatever, who knows, but no. Interestingly, in Ukraine, it seems to be having the latter effect, which is the public is quite resistant to Russia's cyber attacks as well as their kinetic attacks, etc. And they're not necessarily caving. And so it's not clear what cyber effects on the civilian population will have. But clearly it could be very, very pronounced. And one last point, and I'll let him ask more questions. But I think it's a fascinating. Aspect of the fact that now our national security, our national well-being is a function, and others have said this, of the private sector's responsibility, not the federal government. 20, 30 years ago, it was the federal government their job was to have a military to make sure they weren't attacked. And our national well-being was dependent upon that. And even a mishap at what was then the biggest company in the United States, General Motors was hurt by a strike or something or a bomb or God forbid whatever, it maybe would hurt new car sales for a week and maybe there'd be some problems in Detroit, but it wouldn't have a national outcome. Today, if you took out Amazon for a week or Microsoft or Visa or MasterCard or the New York Stock Exchange, we have huge private sector, fundamentally digitally connected networks or completely all digital, where our national well-being depends on those. So that has really profound implications because it's no longer just the government worried that protects our national security, but this responsibility is now shifted to the private sector in ways that are harder to regulate, that are a little more chaotic, a little more difficult, and create all sorts of vulnerabilities.
Yeah. So I was out in an old NSA/Army station. I was out at Vent Hill Farms Station, which went out of service in like 1997. It was a Cold War relic. But I went to the Cold War Museum this weekend. It's near Warrenton, Virginia, and really cool little museum out in the middle of nowhere. Bunch of old NSAers and Army ASAers run it, and they had a civil defense section of it. And I've always thought that being kind of in cyber world for an intelligence world for 30 years now, like I sort of see like where we almost need like a civil defense corps for cyber. And I know a lot of states have stood up National Guard units focused on cyber, and I think that's great because there's a lot of great guardsmen. There's a lot of great talent in the private sector. Usually people into the Guard. But there's just still so many rules, and as a society, we don't really want the government touching our private networks, even though private networks, are in a lot of ways the backbone of our critical infrastructure. Sure. So how do we regulate this better? How do we build trust between government and the private sector? So, when you're like, I'm here from Washington, I'm from Washington, I'm here to help kind of thing. How to say these, there's all these ISACs, that information sharing with financial services industry and other places. And sometimes some classified information gets passed down to them, but nobody knows how to disseminate that to the private sector. Does it all have to be so classified? So anyways, what are your thoughts on how we do this better? How do we protect our water, protect our financial services and our critical infrastructure, even though it's in the private sector?
Big question, and
1 minute or less.
Yeah, exactly. And one that policymakers are struggling with. Obviously, if we had an answer, we would have implemented it because the stakes are so high. Yeah. And so the fact that we haven't been able to do so is illustrative of not only how complex the problem is, but also reflects our politics and a bunch of other things. But the fundamental point is that, I guess, a couple points. One is that this, as I said, this phenomena, this situation of our cyber dependency and the consequences of the digital revolution, the so-called fourth industrial revolution, are that there's been this shift of responsibility from the federal government, which was responsible for our national well-being, principally through military means, broadly generally economic, to the private sector, which of course controls something like 90% of critical infrastructure in the United States. And because of technology, there are so many interdependencies that within the private sector and supply chain vulnerabilities and so on and so forth, that it's fundamentally the private sector that is responsible for our national well-being. And with that responsibility and with that vulnerability comes responsibility. And the question is, how are we going to regulate that? Because in other areas where we have risks and vulnerabilities to national security or safety, we regulate it. That's the American approach. We usually do it, unlike the Europeans, retroactively. The Europeans proactively say, we're going to regulate this particular area of endeavor, and in order for commercial operations to work in that area, you have to fit into certain predefined boxes. We see that right now with the European approach to artificial intelligence. They've got an act that says if you're going to do artificial intelligence, you have to do it this way, train your models this way, have certain clarity about your algorithms and so on and so forth. That's not the United States. We don't want to crimp innovation. We're worried that kind of proactive regulation beforehand is going to hurt innovation. And so our approach to the whole digital revolution has been, let's let the internet develop by itself. Let's have Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act that does not impose liability on Google and Microsoft, whoever, for content on their networks, unlike a book publisher who would be liable. So there's this very American approach to regulation, which is light touch. Let's wait till the problem manifests itself, and then we'll do something about it. And that, by the way, applies not only to, historically applies to other technology. Think about, the automobile developed in, the late 19th century. It took until the 1960s before Congress said seatbelts were mandatory in new cars. It took another, 20 years before all but one state's made it mandatory in each state. New Hampshire is the exception. Live free or die.
Really? Just still not mandatory?
Yeah, if you're over 18, you don't need to wear a seatbelt in New Hampshire. If you're under 18, you do. And so, look at the airplane. It took until, people started flying in airplanes for commercial reasons in the 20s, but it was with almost no regulation. And then in 1934, there was a famous crash killing Newt Rockne, the football legend. It made front page newspapers all around the country. And within weeks, Congress had adopted what then became the National Transportation Safety Board. So we regulate after an accident, after an incident. That's the American approach. There's some advantages to it. We can then focus specifically on the problem. We know what the risks are. You could look at railroads, electricity, pick any form of technology. In cyber, the problem is that we are, again, we're reactive, but it's too late. The technology has grown too fast, too quickly. TikTok was my example, where, as I said, in just a matter of years, it went from 0 to 170 million users. Mm-hmm. And by then it's, as a political matter, too late to deal with it in an easy way. We missed the boat on the internet early on when ARPANET was formed and it was being set up in the 70s. No one was worried about security. We did not require user authentication on the internet. Anybody could be on the internet. It doesn't make it. You can't drive a car, by the way, without a license. Or you need to have your car registered, but you could get on the internet and wreak havoc and send commands around the world and do whatever you want and spread disinformation. We have no idea who you are. Is that a good thing? Well, yeah, anonymity has its benefits. I'm not saying that it doesn't have, there's a side of the coin that isn't benefit, but we failed to recognize the downside of that. We're on the verge of doing that with artificial intelligence, where the window to regulate it properly is closing. Back to your point, I'm deviating a little bit, but I'm just explaining our history of the way we regulate technology retroactively after an incident occurs. The problem is that it moves too quickly for us to quickly regulate it. Another factor is that our policymakers aren't expert in this area. The average age of members of Congress is 58 years old. There are only, I think, 19 or 20 members of Congress who have a PhD. There are about the same number of members of Congress who have only a high school education. They didn't grow up being digitally literate. There's an ever widening gap between our policymakers and the 23-year-old kids in Silicon Valley who are creating the next app. And it's a real challenge for us. Yeah. And so we've got to figure out a way of smartly regulating technology as it develops. And as I said, I hope we do that with artificial intelligence. We've clearly missed the boat on some level with cyber because of the potential for disinformation, the social media mess, and ransomware. I mean, we not to go too deep into ransomware, but we could solve the ransomware problem. You won't like the solution, but the solution would be to really regulate cryptocurrency. Right now, if you walk into the Chase Manhattan Bank, you want to open a bank account, they have a know your customer rule. You need to produce your driver's license and history and back, and they need to know who you are and make sure you're not a drug dealer or child pornographer or weapons evader or whatever. But
did you see my rant about us being debanked? Is that what you're talking about?
No. But I understand. That's right. But on the other hand, if you want to open up a Bitcoin account, no questions asked, you do it. And if we really regulated the cryptocurrency world, it would make it impossible to pay ransom payments, and that would be the end of it. Now, there are lots of downsides to that kind of regulation, I understand, but just saying we could have addressed these problems at an earlier point.
Yeah, I guess you could regulate it, but there'd constantly be like a new illegal cryptocurrency that would pop up, and then
and again, that's why you need to be very agile and on top of this. And as things pop up, and it's whack-a-mole. As soon as you deal with one problem, another one crops up. But we're letting large chunks of problems develop before we slowly turn around and start to regulate them. And look, we haven't even been able to adopt basic privacy legislation in the United States, despite 2 decades of trying. Every other industrialized democracy has baseline protections. And had we had it, much of the concern over TikTok's data, gobbling up data, sucking up data, and potentially sending it to Beijing, but just gobbling up in the first place, would have been regulated by the Privacy Act, and that would have applied to Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and everybody else. We don't have it.
I just feel like the divide's getting even greater. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why people were upset with what CISA was doing in the last administration, but there's a lot of good that came out of CISA, because CISA was, besides the disinformation part of it, there was a lot of information sharing around, or like cyber information. A lot of that stuff's been sort of eviscerated now. And
so we've had statutes expire in this area that are of critical importance. Again, I think the political dysfunction in Washington on both parties is not helping this. Added to the fact that the problem itself is intrinsically complicated, and so you've got a recipe for inaction and continued vulnerabilities.
I've never really been on the political side of Washington. I've been more on the talked about. Saw a little bit of that when I worked on a study at Booz Allen for the Defense Intelligence Agency called Foreign Offshoring Threats to DoD Systems. This was like 2006. We did a unclassified study because DIA wanted to share with the acquisition community and at large where, make them more aware of where their things were coming from.
Sure.
And it needed to be done in an unclassified way.
Sure.
And we did, because it was the IC, they also wanted to create like a secret version of it. It was like, okay, fine, it's not going to go anywhere,
right,
and it'll sit on a shelf somewhere. So we created a whole awareness campaign, a movie. We hired actors through the Screen Actors Guild. We did all kinds of stuff. It was this whole. It saw the light of day. Even the unclassified version saw no light of day, because once Capitol Hill found out that we were doing this unclassified study about how Chinese products were making their way into everyday life, there were the lobbyists. I mean, this was where they were like, you can't say that. An intelligence agency can't say this at an unclassified level. And we were like, why can't we? This is if that would have, something like that, not necessarily that particular study, but if that awareness would have been made 20 years ago at this point more greatly, maybe we wouldn't quite be in the situation we're in today. But who knows? I mean, we still are addicted to cheap, and we were buying cheap stuff. And
again, not to belabor the point, but my TikTok being the microcosm point. I mean, had we addressed it earlier, had we had some way of saying, the only reason TikTok even got caught in the national security apparatus is because ByteDance bought another company, triggering the CFIUS, the acquisition process. But had they not done it through an acquisition, had they just developed it natively, it never would have caught the legal aspects of the national security apparatus. But, if we had some kind of equivalent of, I don't know, Consumers Report or Consumers or the Underwriters Laboratory or the National Academy of Science vetting something, if we had some system that said, before you introduce a foreign technology into the United States, you need to go through some checklist. Where's the data kept? How much data is taken from users? Where are update servers located? All these issues. The consumer has no idea. When you walk into Best Buy and go buy a router, and you see on the shelf a sale for TP-Link routers, which is a perfectly fine router, you don't know that it's made in China. It is, or ultimately backed by a Chinese company. And there's a lot of concerns over potential risks, let alone the software vulnerabilities of it. Forget whether it's foreign or American. How buggy is it? And when you walk into a supermarket and buy a box of cereal, it's got a label on it with nutrition information, and it tells you, something about it. And couldn't we have that kind of a system in some way that say that when you pick up that box of a router, it says, note, made in China, updated in China, or whatever it would say. I'm just picking something. Or it would say, in a standardized test, this was revealed to be, a grade C in terms of software vulnerabilities, and so we could do a lot more. Of course, there'd be industry pushback, and yes, I understand it's complicated and more regulation and more bureaucracy. I get all that. I understand all the negative arguments, but we're allowing all these negative arguments to not to, instead of producing a compromise and a smart solution, saying, yeah, good point, we can figure out a solution, it just shuts it down. And in today's politics, to amplify your point, we're not able to reach compromises, and we should be able to reach some smart compromises. We don't want the full European regulation. I get that. We don't want a crib industry. We don't want more bureaucracy. But on the other hand, doing nothing is not.
Europeans are way more data driven. They see
Yes.
They're like, okay, there's a problem. The data says if we do this, we'll solve the problem, and then they execute on that. And
with varying results,
right? Like GDPR, right?
Right. Which they've been tweaking. Mixed results. They've been tweaking. And I think there's some very positive things that came out of it, but there are also a lot of negatives. And I'm not saying we need to go that route, but our current system of fundamentally not addressing these vulnerabilities and risk isn't working.
It's not working at all. Back to the line of what is war and cyber. The nuke on the Sony building versus the cyber on the Sony building. I feel like my line is like, at the time I felt like that was an act of war.
Right.
But what are your thoughts? Like, where do you start to draw this line?
A lot of lawyers of the military and others have been thinking heavily about this. There's something called the Tallinn Manual that you may know that grew out of meetings in Estonia, which is sort of the Bible in this area. First of all, we're dealing with international law, so let's start with that, which is there's a domestic law piece of it, which is what you can do. But the U.S. is pretty clear. We've got something called the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which, if anything, needs to be changed.
That is way outdated.
Yeah, way outdated, and it stifles legitimate activity. But put that aside for a second. But we're operating in the world of international law, where fundamentally we're talking about the UN Charter and the NATO Treaty and other kinds of things. There is something called the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, which goes back to 2001 or so, but it's very outdated, very limited. We clearly need something in that area. The UN's been working on it with mixed results. But we're in the area of international law, which by definition means it's just consensus and agreement. There's no court that imposes this. It's just agreement among nations and common practice. And I think the understanding is the consensus probably is something like, if you have a cyber activity that produces on a scale and scope equivalent to what a kinetic attack would look like, then it might be an act of war. Let me give an example. If you have a bomb that drops somewhere, it's very clear. If it kills people, damages something, then that's unquestionably an act of war. We know that. We don't need a lot of argument about it. We know where it is. There's no attribution question. We can see the effect, etc. Cyber is a little difficult. We need to figure out where it came from, who did it, etc. Assuming we could get over the attribution problem, which is a big one,
right,
and know in reasonable time period with certainty who did it. Question is, what's the effect? Did it close down an electric grid for 1 minute? Well, that's nasty and unfortunate, and we don't like that, but probably not, at the grand scheme of things, something we're going to bleed and die over, right?
Yeah.
What if it's 20 minutes? Well, that's inconvenient. 3 hours? Maybe someone might be dying on an operating table. That's a concern, God forbid. 6 days, wow, that's a real problem. And because that has economic effect, people's lives might be affected, et cetera. So at some point, and no one knows where to draw that line, it's shades of gray, something starts to look like it has the scale and effect and intensity and consequences equivalent to a physical attack. And at that point, the cyber attack would be deemed an act of war. And we just saw a vivid illustration of this in Poland, where apparently Russia, I say apparently because that's what the Polish authorities attributed to, had a wide-ranging attack on Poland's electric and energy grids. As it happened, Poland was able to deflect most of it. They have great firewalls and great offensive and defensive capabilities. So it didn't produce the intended effect, which was to shut down a lot of energy in the winter and make it life miserable for people. So it actually didn't have the intended effect, although that was the intent. Fortunately, no lives were lost. There doesn't appear to be material property damage. There's some. It probably doesn't rise to the level of an act of war. Had it had more serious consequences, then yes, it would. The problem here is twofold. One, it's possible to still produce a lot of harm short of the act of war, so that's a bad thing. And second, and Russia's particularly good at this, is they engage in incremental activity. The problem with engaging in incremental activity, I'll explain that in a second, is it creates an asymmetric advantage for the attacker. What do I mean by that? So if Russia just disrupts your electric grid for 5 minutes, you're probably not going to do anything about it. If they disrupt your grid for 10 minutes, also an hour, probably not. Like demand their ambassadors be recalled, impose sanctions. If they do it for the day, well, that's going to get uncomfortable. You're probably not going to start sending tanks rolling across the border, right? And NATO would probably not regard a Russian attack on the Polish electric grid that was just lasting for a day as an act of war. Probably not. It would probably not invoke Article 5, the collective self-defense obligation, the collective defense obligation. But at some point, Russia could do something to the Polish electric grid or infrastructure that would start to look like an act of war. And maybe that's a 5-day thing. And then someone's going to say, well, wait a minute. We were okay with 3 days. What is it about 5 days that suddenly produced an act of war? Now, obviously, if there was an actual kinetic effect, people died or damage, that's a different thing. But what if it was just incremental, a little more, but didn't quite reach that point? And so that means Russia can keep raising that, make it more gray. It doesn't quite get black yet, but they can make it more gray. And the range of activity of maliciousness can keep increasing. And you're, as the victim, and you're going to find it harder and harder to say, well, wait a minute, 4 minutes was okay, but now 5 minutes is not okay. And that's why they have this incredible asymmetric advantage with incrementally just sticking another little stick at you.
Yeah. Especially if there's like a disinformation campaign going on, sure, with that's making people question the attribution part of it. And that's so easy to do in such a divided society.
And of course, the problem with attribution is you want it to happen quickly. If you discover, as America did, months and months later, who was responsible for the solar wind attacks, it doesn't have that sense of immediacy. So something happened 2 years ago. You say, oh, we just discovered it was the GRU or the Ministry of State Security. That was years ago. Who remembers it? So it has to be timely. And it has to be accurate. And you have to have confidence in it. If you merely say, we think it was the GRU because the signatures look the same. They use some servers that we associate with the GRU, but could have been anybody else. But we don't know that. That's not good enough, obviously. And then if the answer is, well, you really need to be certain and you need to prove it, parentheses, go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis where we had photographs of that Russian, in
tough to do in cyber.
Well, right, really tough to do in cyber. And do you want to do that? Do you want to show the bad guys that you know exactly how you know about them?
Yeah, like to me, I still wonder, maybe you can't talk about it here, we'll know, but like, is there somewhere and on some server up at the fort at NSA right now where we have evidence of, Chinese military or senior officials during COVID talking about how COVID started in a lab, and we just hadn't released that to like kind of tell everybody. I am assuming we do have something like that. Like we do have somebody collected something somewhere that basically attributes COVID to China. But we haven't released it because of the sources and methods issue associated with that. And then, but fast forward to, I feel like it'd be interesting. Maybe this has already happened. I'm just not aware of it. Like if we ran a national level war game tabletop exercise, not necessarily for the American people, but maybe for the American people. Yeah. So if you could get like a small percentage of the population to not believe that it was China that was behind it or Russia behind it or whoever, the Cubans, whatever was behind it, how much could that slow us down in our response? Do you feel like this is a bigger problem than the disinformation problem is bigger than the cyber problem?
I actually think that yes, exactly right. I think the disinformation concern, the risks of an outcome changed by disinformation is greater than the risk of an outcome change purely by cyber. Not that that cyber isn't important. So let's assume that China wants to invade Taiwan, and they announce a blockade. The U.S. military starts moving some ships and other assets into the area, and we're on the verge of hostilities. And China decides it wants to use cyber against domestic targets in the United States, and they interfere with the New York Stock Exchange or interfere with Visa or MasterCard. Yes, that would be have a significant economic effect. It'd be greatly annoying. It might backfire and cause the American public to be more annoyed with China, or maybe the American public will say, "Gosh, if that's the price, I don't want to pay it." Who knows? But it isn't totally clear that a direct cyber effect would have that. No. Exactly what the effect would be, and even so, it would be transitory. So if the New York Stock Exchanges or whatever some brokerage thing is taken down, they'll fix it, and 2 days later be back online, or a cloud provider or whatever. So it's transitory. You get to use it once. No, that's the end of it.
Unless it's like space
Exactly
related.
There are things that could all vision, but by contrast, disinformation is more pernicious, could have a significant effect. If all that happens is 5% or 10% of the people, through subtle videos on Facebook and TikTok and elsewhere, Twitter, through fake accounts, people start to become confused about what we're really doing. Is Taiwan really worth it anyway? And besides, it's sort of a corrupt, nasty place. I mean, I'm making all So if that starts happening to 5 or 10% of the people, wouldn't take much, start to wonder, well, maybe Taiwan's not really worth fighting over. I don't want my son or daughter to go over there in the military. So you could easily see a disinformation campaign having a strategic outcome that a cyber alone campaign would. Now, of course, China could also use cyber to disrupt command and control of military assets and pre-positioning. I mean, the cyber can still play a vital role in a conflict, and a very effective role. But alone, it's probably not going to change outcomes strategically.
Well, Glenn, thank you. This has been such an interesting conversation. We'll have to get you on a panel or something else sometime soon. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
On the Coded for Chaos podcast. Hope to have you on again soon.
This has been great. Really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.